faces. Hello, everybody. We're Today's class is going to be one of those speed demon classes. So you have to fasten your seatbelts, and we're going to do it's how would I describe this? So it's like, if you went to Universal Studios, boy, this is a long time ago. Universal Studios used to have a Back to the Future ride. I don't know if they still do or not because the movie's so old now. But you'd strap in and then they take you into the past and whatever. So this is kind of like that. This is going to be a Back to the Future ride, 4,000 years of Jewish history in 1 hour. So that's why I say strap yourselves in and we'll get started. So welcome everybody. I'm going to do the share screen again. Whoops, wait, share screen again. And we're going to pull up the, let's see if that works. There it is. Okay, so I've divided up Jewish history in the handout, which hopefully you all got to download. I've divided the handout up into 4 different time periods. The first period is the biblical period, and then there's like Second Temple rabbinic period. And then I'm going to admit some more people here. Okay. And the Second Temple rabbinic period, and then the Middle Ages, and then the modern era. So I'm going to spend a little more time on the biblical and rabbinic period because that's kind of the formative stages of Judaism. And then I'll kind of skim through the Middle Ages and modern period. One of the things about having the handout with the sort of the timeline and important people to know during those time periods is that if you're interested in history, you can, and now with Rabbi Google, you can Google those names and dates and events, and you can learn more about it just by going to Wikipedia or something. So so let's go to, let's start with the biblical period. So 4,000 years of Jewish history. We'll start with Abraham. By the way, the farther back in time we go, obviously, the less sure we are about what historically actually happened and when it happened, right? There's not very much other material that we've discovered from other cultures that we can correlate as to, when, what, who, and what the story was about. But roughly speaking, Abraham would have been around 1700 before the Common Era. And we consider Abraham the first Jew. Of course, in Christianity, he's also the patriarch for what becomes Christianity. And in Islam, he's also the first patriarch of what becomes Islam. So that's why those three traditions, sometimes we call ourselves the Abrahamic faiths, because we all trace our history back to Abraham. So he would have been around the year 1700. According to the book of Genesis, he began in the Fertile Crescent, what was called Mesopotamia, now called Iraq, between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And he grew up in a town called Ur, which was a very large, not town, a big metropolis, highly advanced civilization for its time. He left with his father, followed the river past Babylon, which became the capital of Babylonia later in centuries later. But again, another major metropolitan city. Passes Babylon and he goes to Haran, which is a city in Syria. And that's where the family stops. And from there, we read in the Torah portion yesterday morning, God comes to Abraham and says, leave your father's home. So Abraham had traveled with his father most of this journey from Mesopotamia into Syria. According to the Bible, again, his father had intended to go settle in Canaan, which became Israel. But for whatever reason, his father stopped short of the journey, ended in Syria. And that's when God comes to Abraham and says, I want you now to finish that journey. I'm going to take you into Canaan. So Abraham goes to Canaan then. Then he raises a family. He has Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac has Jacob and Esau. Jacob has 12 sons, including Joseph. Uh, you know, the story of Joseph being, so we're going to come back to this story in a few sessions. I'm going to look closely at the story of Joseph to show you some problems in the text. But his brothers hate him because he thinks he's better than everybody. So they sell him to be a slave in Egypt, and that's how he rises to a position of importance there. And when there's a famine throughout the Middle East, the Egyptians have stored food thanks to Joseph. His family comes to visit him for the food. They settle in Egypt and then become enslaved by a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. And that's in the book of Exodus. So all of what I just said is in the book of Genesis. Now we're into the book of Exodus, and within the first few chapters, the Israelites are enslaved. Moses grows up in the Pharaoh's court. He kills an Egyptian taskmaster and runs away, spends 40 years tending the flocks of his father-in-law, and at the age of 80, God comes to him in a burning bush and says, you have to go back to Egypt and rescue the rest of your people. So the first 80 years of Moses' life happens within the first 3 or 4 chapters of Exodus. The rest of the book of Exodus is about getting out of Egypt and beginning the journey back to Israel. And the rest of the journey is conducted through the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. At the end of the book of Deuteronomy, the Israelites have still not returned. Moses dies, Joshua takes over, and they begin the conquest of the land. Joshua dies, and there's the period of the judges, who there's sort of, this is an important thing. Let me just, I like to analogize to American history. So the first attempt at uniting the states of the colonies in the United States in America was the Articles of Confederation, which basically left a lot of state power, individual state power, a very loose federal government, which had very little power, and it fell apart because it was not united enough. And that's when they decided they needed a stronger national government. That's when they had the Constitution, and it became the United States of America. So the period of the judges is kind of like the confederated tribes of Israel. They're individual tribes. The individual tribes have a lot of autonomy. Every now and then, a couple of tribes will get together to fight off a common enemy, but they're not really united. It wasn't until they said we need a king to unite us, and they get King Saul, that they become what I would say the united tribes of Israel. Right? So under King Saul dies, it becomes King David. King David dies, and his son Solomon takes over. Solomon builds the first temple. And when Solomon dies, we have another analogy to American history. All right, so looking on this timeline now, the period of the judges that I described was around 1200 to 1020. Samuel, the prophet Samuel, anoints King Saul around 1020. King David becomes the king around 1000. It's a nice, easy number to remember. Probably not exactly 1000, but around that time, King David is king. And when he dies, King Solomon takes over. When King Solomon dies, the analogy to the United States is the northern tribes secede from the south, just like we had the southern tribes, southern states seceding from the Union. In the Israelite history, the northern tribes secede from the southern kingdom. That's 10 tribes in the north, 2 tribes in the south. The 2 tribes in the south are the tribe of Judah and the much smaller tribe of Benjamin. And since Benjamin is a smaller tribe, the southern kingdom is known as the kingdom of Judah for the largest tribe. The northern kingdom, in the meantime, has 10 tribes and is therefore sometimes just called Israel because 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel are in the north, so they still call themselves Israel. Sometimes the prophets will refer to the northern kingdom as Ephraim, which was one of those 10 tribes, obviously one of the most important tribes of the north. So sometimes the northern kingdom is called Ephraim. That all goes on from 961 after King Solomon dies until, King Solomon is 961 to 922. The northern tribes secede in 922. And so you now have these different prophets prophesying in the northern and southern kingdom. Between 922 and 722, that they remain separate kingdoms. In 722, 200 years later, the northern kingdom is conquered by the Assyrian Empire. That's the kingdom to the east in the Mesopotamian region. The big powerful country, the empire in the east between the Tigris and Euphrates River is the Assyrian Empire. They come in and conquer the northern kingdom. They take the 10 tribes captive and they disappear. And that's why you may sometimes hear people talk about the 10 lost tribes of Israel. We don't hear from them again in history. Now, that's not entirely true, as I'm going to explain again a few weeks from now when I talk about how the Bible was written. We believe that many of the people from the 10 tribes fled the northern kingdom while it was being conquered. I mean, it didn't happen overnight, it happened over a period of a couple of years. So they were refugees. They fled the northern kingdom and joined their cousins in the south. Better, whatever your differences are with your cousins in the south, better to live with them than to be taken captive by these barbarians back east, right? So many of them fled and brought their traditions with them, and they mingled with the people in the southern kingdom. Here's a few other tribes and kings. King Hezekiah is famous for fending off the attack of the Assyrian Empire in the year 715 or 701. The Assyrian Empire tries to conquer the southern kingdom. They're not successful. And by this time, King Hezekiah, we now have archaeological evidence of the validity of the stories that are going on in the Bible, right? Something we don't have solid evidence for before this year, before this time. So the Bible says that King Hezekiah fortified the city of Jerusalem and built huge towers, that he dug a tunnel to draw the water that was coming from a well outside the city. He dug a tunnel to draw the water into the city, and he closed off the well from the outside so that if the Assyrian army came to lay siege to the city, they would not have access to the water, but the city would have access to the water and they could outlast the invading army. You can walk through that tunnel today that Hezekiah built. That's one of the archaeological finds we've discovered. You can walk through the tunnel to see the tunnel that Hezekiah used to bring the water into the city. And you can also see the remains of one of the towers that Hezekiah built to fortify the city. So we have archaeological evidence of that. We also, by the way, have archaeological evidence back in Assyria. Sennacherib, the king of Assyria at the time, laid siege to the city, was very proud of all his conquests. And they didn't have newspapers back then. What they did have was big walls on palaces, and they would get hire artists to inscribe battle scenes on these walls. And so there's a famous scene of the battle of some of the cities in the south that he conquered. And he also records in clay tablets his conquests, and he describes how he had King Hezekiah, he names him, King Hezekiah, trapped like a bird in a cage. Now you have to know that, what do we call fake news or spin doctoring the news is not a new concept. And in the time of Hezekiah, he was able to say that he had King Hezekiah trapped like a bird in a cage because he had laid siege to the city. What he was not able to say was that he conquered the city, that he took anybody captive, and that's not said. So clearly the city survived the siege, even though he had laid siege to it. King Josiah does a reformation. He does a reconstruction project in the temple. He claims to have found a scroll of Moses in the temple, which talks about worshiping God only in one place. He therefore destroys the small shrines that had been developed in little villages around in the southern kingdom. He destroys all the local shrines, and he says to the Judeans, if you want to worship God, you have to come to my temple in Jerusalem to worship, because that's what it says in the scroll. And We know, so you might say, wow, that was a big power grab. But we happen to know that those small shrines in the little towns were not kosher. That is, again, archaeologists have dug up the homes and villages of some of these places, and they found little temple shrines with little figures of a man and little figures of women. Well, what does that mean? It means that these country bumpkins in the little towns and villages didn't quite understand monotheism. They didn't get the idea that there's only one God and that God doesn't have a gender. They kind of seemed to believe what other peoples at the time believed, that there was a male God and a female God. So when they're worshiping God in their little local shrines, they're not doing it the right way. And that basically was what Josiah was concerned about. And so he said, let's make sure we do it right. It has to be done under the auspices of the government. So let's come to Jerusalem to worship God. Jeremiah is a very sad prophet. Toward the end of the first temple period, he tells the king, you are a bad guy. You're not following God's laws. God's not happy. You are oppressing the widows and orphans and the poor people. The Babylonian Empire is powerful, and God is going to let them conquer us. And for his honesty, speaking truth to power, he is put in jail. And from his jail cell, he has to watch the destruction of the southern kingdom, helpless really to do anything about it. A very tragic case of a prophet. In any case, the city of Jerusalem falls in 586. Jews are deported to Babylonia. And in the Babylonian exile, the prophet Ezekiel comes. Hopefully you've heard some of these names if you study the Bible. So Ezekiel is a prophet to the Jews in exile in Babylonia. And he has a famous vision of dead bodies coming back to life. Some people suggest that he actually did look out over a valley that was a battlefield, that had been a battlefield months earlier. And all that's left on the battlefield now are skeletons of the soldiers. And his vision, of course, my view is none of this actually happened. It's just his imagination now. He saw the battlefield full of skeletons, and in his imagination, or in his inspiration, I would say, he was inspired to see how those skeletons might come back to life and grow flesh and clothes and become a people again. And the message he gets from God based on that vision is that the Israelites believe they are like those skeletons lying on the battlefield. They're dried out, desiccated, dying people, and they're going to die in captivity and never return back to life. And God says to Ezekiel, it's not true. You have to tell the people that it's not over. They're not going to die in captivity. They will live, and they will return to their homeland, and they will rebuild their country, and you will once again dwell in your land. That's the vision of the dry bones. And who would have guessed? But so Ezekiel is 573. Some 40 years later, or 35 years later, Cyrus of Persia conquers the Babylonian Empire. And guess what he says? Go home. Who would have guessed in Ezekiel's time that his prophecy would come true? It seemed so impossible. How could we ever return home? This powerful empire has conquered us. We're going to die here for sure. But no, the Persian Empire conquers the Babylonian Empire, and King Cyrus of Persia tells the Jews, I want you to go home and rebuild your homeland. Not only that, I am going to pay you. I am going to provide the money to help you rebuild your temple so you can worship your God in your homeland. Who would have guessed that? And yet that's exactly what happened. And again, we have archaeological proof that this is exactly what happened, because archaeologists have uncovered several copies of what's called the Cyrus cylinder. So the Persian Empire had a brilliant method. They didn't have newspapers again, no printing presses, but they had a way of getting the word out to the far reaches of their kingdom. And how did they do it? They would get a scroll, a clay scroll on which they would inscribe the words they wanted to get of the message. And then they would take these little cylinders and they would send them out on horsemen who would go throughout the different range of the empire. And everywhere they went, all they had to do was get a clump of clay, roll the clump of clay out, and then roll the cylinder over the clay, and the words would magically appear in the clay. Isn't that clever? And so instead of a printing press, this is how they would reproduce the message all over the kingdom. And we have several copies of this Cyrus cylinder, which says to the captives of Persia, go home and resettle in your homeland. So we know for sure this really did happen, and the Second Temple was built. So the Second Temple is being built. Many Jews do not return home, however. They had already been living in the Persian Empire or Babylonia, what became the Persian Empire, for a couple of generations. They had developed comfortable lives. They had friends, they had family, they had businesses. They didn't want to go back to the Wild West to rebuild a country. So they stayed in the Persian Empire, even though they could go home. That's when the story of Esther takes place. But Ezra the scribe leaves Persia to return to Jerusalem. And as a scribe, he is the master of the tradition and the copying of the sources. And he brings with him the 5 books of Moses in the Torah scroll, and he reads it aloud to the people of Israel, and they say, yes, this is our story. Okay, everything's fine and good. We're living under Persian rule until Alexander the Great from Greece conquers the known world in about the year 336, and then dies at a very young age. And so now he conquers even Persia. So now people are living under Greek influence, with Greek philosophy, Greek literature wildly taking over the cultures that everywhere that they conquered. When Alexander the Great dies, his kingdom is divided into several parts. One part is ruled from Egypt by the Ptolemies in Alexandria, Egypt. One part is ruled from Syria in Antioch, which is in Syria. That's the capital of Syria. And the Seleucids, or the Seleucids, are the Greeks who are ruling from Syria. The Ptolemies are ruling from Egypt. And Israel is right between Egypt and Syria. Israel's right in the middle. So sometimes we're under Egyptian control. Sometimes we're under Syrian control. And the story of Hanukkah takes place when the Syrian Greeks under Antiochus IV is ruling over Israel. We'll talk more about this for Hanukkah. It's the Hanukkah story. We'll explain what happened then. Then comes the Roman Empire. The Romans conquer the Greek Empire. And so now we're under Roman rule, and we're coming into the modern modern millennia times, right? The last couple people I mentioned here are Hillel and Shammai, 2 early sages who are interpreters of Jewish law. Okay, so that ends kind of that period. Here's a outline of the books of the Bible, which are the important books to know. The Bible in the Jewish tradition is divided, although what Christians call the Old Testament, that's what we just call the Bible, because that's all we have for the Bible, just the Old Testament. So we don't call it the Old Testament because that assumes there's a New Testament, and the New Testament is not part of our sacred literature. So instead of calling it the Old Testament, in English, we sometimes call it just the Bible. There is a Hebrew name for it, and that's based on how we organize the books in the Bible. So even though we have the same books that Christians have in the Old Testament, we structure them differently. So for instance, the Christian Bible puts the book of Ruth right after the book of Judges, because it says it took place during the period of the Judges. So Christians have organized logically the books in historical order. We didn't do that for different reasons. The first 5 books are the same, however. What we call the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, are the same as in the same order as a Christian Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We have Hebrew names for those books, and they're over here: Bereshit, Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Devarim. Okay. Sometimes we call the 5 books of Moses the Torah. We also call it the Chumash, which comes from the Hebrew word chamesh, which means 5. The second section, here's where we start to differ. The second section of the Bible we call prophets, or Nevi'im. And the first set of books in the section called prophets are what I call historical books. And these all appear in a historical order: the book of Joshua, then Judges, then Samuel 1 and 2. Joshua is about the story of Joshua, obviously. Judges is a period of judges, and here's some of the famous ones. And then Samuel is the prophet Samuel, who anoints the first 2 kings of Israel. So the book of Samuel is really the stories of King Saul and King David. The prophet himself, the prophet Samuel, dies before the end of book 1 of Samuel. He is not even in book 2 of Samuel. So you might ask, why is book 2 of Samuel still called Samuel? Well, I'm glad you asked. So the answer is that it used to be all one big long book. But you have to remember that books were not like, let's see if I can get this into here. This is a book, and it has pages. Oh, pages. Books weren't done like this originally. Books were written in scroll form. They weren't connected on one edge like this, one spine. They were connected on both ends, like a roll of paper towels. That's how they made books. They would connect the pages on both ends and then roll them up into a scroll. The problem was that the book of Samuel was too long a story, too unwieldy to use as a single scroll. So at some point early in its history, somebody decided to cut it in half and arbitrarily chose a place to stop the part 1 and then start a new scroll for part 2. So it originally was the book of Samuel and was the whole thing. Now it's Samuel part 1, Samuel part 2. Got it? The same thing happened with the books of Kings. Kings 1 and 2, originally one long scroll, but it was too unwieldy, so it was divided into 2 parts. And this is the story, the rest of the history, the royal history of everybody after David. So from the time period of Solomon until the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the conquest of the Babylonian Empire. So that's the rest of the royal history, Kings 1 and 2. Those are historical books. Then come what I call the 3 biggies. They're the biggies because they have big books, not because they're necessarily any more important than other prophets, but there's more written under their name. So that's Isaiah, and these are in chronological order: Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. As I said, Ezekiel is a prophet of the exile. Jeremiah was a prophet during the time of the destruction of the city. Isaiah was a prophet who was during the time of King Hezekiah. However, everybody with me so far? Nod yes? Okay. However, Isaiah is not one prophet. Clearly not one prophet. The first part of Isaiah is about a prophet who lived during the time of Hezekiah. But the second half of Isaiah, somewhere in chapter 40 or so, is clearly somebody who's talking in the exile to the Jews who are already exiled. So we're not exactly sure what happened. Nobody was around to tell us. But this might be the opposite of what happened with cutting the book of Samuel into 2 parts and cutting the book of Kings into 2 parts. There might have been 2 prophets, both named Isaiah, or the second prophet, we don't know what his name was. But somehow this second prophet got attached to the first prophet, and now it's one scroll of Isaiah. But if you read it, you will clearly see that the second half of that book is not written at the same time as King Hezekiah. It's talking to the exiles in Babylonia. Okay, then comes what we call the 12 minor prophets, and they're minor only because, again, they're small books. And again, they are ordered in chronological order: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, and so on. There are 12 of them. And since they were such small books, Apparently, at a very early stage, the 12 books were combined into one scroll. So that's the 12 minor prophets. Then comes the third section of the Bible, the way we organize the books. And that is, first of all, we call it writings, or ketuvim, which is the Hebrew word for writings. The first three books are large. The book of Psalms, the first Jewish prayer book, in Hebrew called Tehillim. The second book is a book of Proverbs, wisdom sayings, in Hebrew called Mishlei. And then the book of Job, and in Hebrew his name is Eov. The story of Job is a very late book. It's the story of a righteous man who suffers. And this is a fascinating book in the Bible because most of the Bible says, if you're good, you get rewarded, and if you're bad, you get punished. And here comes the book of Job and says, no, this was a good guy, and he suffered anyway. And thank God, in a way, this book was written and included in our Bible because it gives modern people some possibilities for understanding why bad things happen to good people. You have to read it kind of with a modern eye. But anyway, that's the subject of another story. In any case, those three books together, Psalms, Proverbs, and Job, are called wisdom literature. They're the first three sections. Then comes a section called the five Megillot, the five scrolls. These were still called scrolls because even after we started producing books with bindings, we kept these five short books in scroll form because we read them on certain holidays. So each of them is read on a particular holiday. The Song of Songs is read on Passover. In Hebrew, it's called Shir HaShirim. The book of Ruth is actually, that's the Hebrew name, Ruth, and it's read on Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks. Lamentations is a book of dirges, right? Poetry about the destruction of the temple, laments. They are very sad poems and gruesome, actually, in their description of the destruction. In Hebrew, it's called Echa. We read it on Tisha B'Av, which is the holiday in the summer that we commemorate the destruction of the temple. Ecclesiastes is called Kohelet. It's a book of wisdom, probably written in Greek times. And we read that on Sukkot. I think we talked about it when we talked about the holiday. And finally, the book of Esther, which tells the story of Purim, and again is written late in Jewish history. And it is the only one that's still read in scroll form in most synagogues. And so when a Jew says today we're going to read the Megillah, they're usually talking about the book of Esther. The other books we now read from books. But for a while they were still read from scrolls. Then finally, the last part of the writing section is the post-exilic books, the books of the return from exile. Daniel, who is a prophet in exile, but really is written much later. Maybe I'll talk a little about that on Hanukkah, I'll explain why. And the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, who are the prophets of the return from exile, post-exilic books. And then what I call reruns, which is the books of Chronicles 1 and 2. They tell the stories of the books of Kings. It's a retelling of the history of the kings of Israel, but from a slightly different perspective. So the stories are very, very similar. Sometimes the language is very similar, but with some different details, which makes life interesting. That's how we divide the Bible up. Now, one last thing to say about it. One thing you can do in Hebrew, since Hebrew is a language of consonants, all the letters of the alphabet are consonants. The vowels got put in later. You can take a string of consonants and create a word by throwing in some vowels, right? And so that's what we did. If we want to call the Bible something in Hebrew, what we do is we take the three parts of the Bible, Torah, Nevi'im, the prophet section, and Ketuvim, the writing section, and we take the first letter of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, and we create a word, Tanakh, right? And so that's what we call the Bible in Hebrew, the Tanakh. Okay, now I can leave this subject and we'll go on to the rabbinic period. Everybody with me so far? Okay. So we have Hillel and Shammai. That's where we left off in our last exciting historical episode. Hillel and Shammai start these two schools of thought, two schools of interpretation of Jewish law and tradition. Shammai is a more strict constructionist. By the way, again, I can analogize to American jurisprudence for those of you who study law, right? And we just had Supreme Court nominee, right? And there's talk about how she's an originalist. Supposedly, originalists want to know, what did the writers of the Constitution think when they wrote these things? We want to know what they thought, because that's what's important. That's the strict constructionist view. And that was kind of Shammai. Hillel was a more liberal interpreter. He also was a friendlier guy. And just like in America, we have Republicans and Democrats. In the Congress of Jewish people at the time, which was called the Sanhedrin, we had different parties and factions. The school of Hillel was the larger faction. They had a majority vote in the Congress, in the Sanhedrin. So nearly every time when there was a difference of opinion between the school of Hillel and Shammai, Hillel's school won. We followed the more lenient opinion. In any case, we'll talk more about the Messiah and Jesus in a later class. The Jews were not happy being under Roman rule. They were always seeking to revolt against the Romans and to declare independence so they could worship the way they wanted to, unhindered by a foreign pagan power, and also so they didn't have to pay the heavy taxes that the Romans imposed on them. And in the year 66, they started a tremendous revolt against Rome, which lasted for several years, which is pretty impressive for a small, tiny country fighting a powerful Roman Empire. So we started in 66, this tremendous revolt against Rome. Unfortunately, we lost. The Romans crushed the rebellion. They destroyed the city of Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple, and they slaughtered thousands of the citizens. And it was a devastating event for the Jews. So now we have to put the pieces back together. We have to reconstruct our way of life without a temple, without the temple being the central focus of our spiritual and religious life. And we had the sages, again, analogizing to America, the founding fathers, which I did a separate talk about at a Lunch and Learn. Oh, I encourage everybody to find it. Maybe I'll send out the link to it if you want to watch it. We had the founding fathers of what became Judaism jump into this vacuum, this void, and say, we can create a rich structure of Jewish life and religion that doesn't require a temple. And that project began really before the temple was destroyed, but took on more urgency after the temple was destroyed. And it culminated in this Mishnah, which was completed in the year 217. Which kind of just outlined what Jewish life and practice should look like, kind of a code of Jewish law, an early attempt at a code of Jewish law in the year 200. Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire in 323, and from then on, Jewish life in Israel becomes very, very difficult. The Byzantine Empire persecutes the Jewish people. The Jewish people in Israel start to decline. The Mishnah, meanwhile, is being studied in the academies, and in Israel, those academies produce a commentary on the Mishnah called the Jerusalem Talmud around the year 400. Meanwhile, the Jewish community back in the Fertile Crescent region, what we still call Babylonia, even though the Babylonian Empire has been gone for centuries, back in Babylonia, the Jewish people are thriving, and that community creates a Talmud on the Mishnah around 150 years later called the Babylonian Talmud. So when Jews today say they're going to study the Talmud, they're studying the Babylonian Talmud. It was more advanced, it was better edited, and it also got better PR. Since the Jews in the Babylonian community were thriving, they were able to reproduce multiple copies of the Talmud and to send it out across the international trade routes all across North Africa and into Europe. So Jewish communities all over the world would be studying the Babylonian Talmud. Here are some famous rabbis from this time period: Hillel and Shammai, as I mentioned before. Before them, Shimon HaTzadik, who is Simon the Righteous. He said, on three things the world stands: on Torah, the study of our tradition; on Avodah, the worship of God; and on Gemilut Chasadim, acts of kindness. This is a really important statement of his, so I kind of highlighted it here. And I would say this is what the Jewish world is about. Really, Judaism can be sort of summarized in these three ideas: studying our sacred literature, worshiping God, and doing acts of kindness for humanity. Right? That's one good summary of Judaism. Hillel and Shammai are a little bit later. Yochanan ben Zakkai escapes the destruction of the temple and starts an academy in Yavne. He's an important character. Here are two other rabbis who different schools of thought: Akiba and Ishmael. Rabbi Akiba supports the second great revolt against the Romans, which was the Bar Kokhba revolt in 134. That revolt is also crushed, unfortunately. And finally, the Yehuda Nasi is the one who edited the Mishnah into its context. And then the first generation of people interpreting the Mishnah are Rav and Shmuel, both in Babylonia. More about them in that program I did on the founding fathers of Judaism. Here's a summary of the literature of the time period. The Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha are Jewish books that were being written in that Second Temple period before Christianity. If you want to understand Christianity, you need to understand what Jews were writing and thinking during the centuries right before Jesus. So it's good to know these books. They're a little hard to find, but you can get copies of them now. They're kind of weird. It's a lot of Jews were thinking a lot of strange ideas back then, but that's stuff that didn't make it into our sacred literature, but was ideas floating around in the Jewish world at the time. And this is kind of a summary of what the Mishnah and the Talmud look like. I'm going to skip over that for brevity here. They also did some other kinds of interpretation of Jewish literature, and that's the rabbinic period. Now, I've only got 10 minutes to finish the rest of Jewish history. So just briefly, after the Talmud is finished, we begin the Middle Ages. So Muhammad reigns from 570. That's the rise of Islam. There's the Golden Age of Spain, which was a time period when Spain was ruled by enlightened Muslims. And while the rest of Europe was in the Dark Ages, these Muslims in Spain had translated Greek philosophy into Arabic. They studied philosophy, science, medicine, art. It was a very highly advanced, flourishing civilization. Jews and Christians both were able to enjoy the benefits of that. And the Jews in the Golden Age produced a huge amount of poetry, art, literature, philosophy, and writing. And here are some of the characters in the Jewish world who lived during that time period. Back in France, Rabbeinu Gershom was an important rabbi who decreed that from now on, men can only have one wife. And if you ever wondered, how is it that Jacob has 2 wives and 2 concubines, and Abraham has a wife and a concubine, all that other stuff? Well, by the time of the year 1000, that was forbidden, at least in the Ashkenazic world. The Jews of France, Germany, Poland, Russia, since the time of 1000, that was forbidden. Occasionally you would find in some of the Sephardic countries, the Jews of Spain and North Africa, men might have more than one wife. Look, that's just how life was back then. I'm not going to, I don't want to say it was good. It's what it was. Rashi is a very important, famous commentator. He grew wine. He grew grapes and made wine for a living. So he had time and he studied on his own, and he wrote a commentary on the entire Bible, and he wrote a commentary on almost the entire Talmud. And his commentary is considered really like crucial for understanding the Jewish world. He's one of the most quoted commentators of the early period of Jewish tradition. That's him. He also lived during the First Crusade. The academies where he studied at in the Rhineland were destroyed by the Crusaders, but their ideas were preserved by Rashi's writings. Maimonides lived at the end of the golden age of Spain and was therefore an enlightened Jewish philosopher. I will refer to him many times in class. Really important person. You have several other crusades in the meantime. Another scholar about 100 years after Maimonides is Nachmanides. So let me just say that the IDES ending is Greek for son of. So Maimonides means son of Maimon. Nachmanides means son of Nachman, right? So they were known by their father's names. Both of them were actually, their first name was Moshe. So it was Moshe ben Maimon, Moshe the son of Maimon, and Moshe ben Nachman, Moshe the son of Nachman. But they were two very different people. Maimonides was a rationalist. Nachmanides was a mystic. Nachmanides was nevertheless one of the great scholars of his time, and unfortunately entered into forced disputation with a Catholic priest over which religion is better, Judaism or Christianity. The church had organized several of these kind of disputations. The Jews were highly restricted in what they could say about Christianity in their arguments. They couldn't say anything blasphemous. Nevertheless, the conditions were if the Jew won, the Jews could live. If the Jewish champion lost, the Jews either had to die, convert, or leave the country. Nachmanides, yeah, Nachmanides won the disputation in Barcelona, but nevertheless had to leave. Anyway, he's famous for several other things, but that's one of the things he's famous for. There was a Talmud burning in France. Jews were expelled from England. Some of these other people. Don Isaac Abarbanel was a treasurer for King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. So I mention this because obviously it has some relevance for America. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were the ones who commissioned Columbus to sail the ocean blue and so on, supposedly discover America. They also, at the time they did that, in fact, almost I think it was the day before Columbus sailed for America, they expelled the Jews from Spain. Under the Catholic Church, they were pretty much forced to either convert the Jews who lived there, kill them, or expel them from their country. So the expulsion of the Jews from Spain was a disaster for the Jews who had been living there for centuries, had a well-developed, highly advanced culture there, and thousands and thousands of Jews were expelled. It was a disaster for the Jewish community in Spain. Don Isaac Barbanel was the treasurer for Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand. He helped them raise the money, but he was Jewish and he was forced to flee as well. Joseph Caro is an important person shortly after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. Many Jews settle in Israel in a little town called Sfat. Joseph Caro is one of those. And in Sfat, this little town up in the north of Israel, he writes what would become the most quoted code of Jewish law until today, the Shulchan Aruch, which means the set table. So Joseph Caro compiled the last major code of Jewish law called the Shulchan Aruch. The first ghetto was established in Venice. This is something a lot of people don't know. The Hebrew word ghetto, the English word ghetto comes from the Italian ghetto, and ghetto in Italian means iron foundry. So what does that have to do with the ghetto? Well, in Venice, the Christians there decided that they didn't like the Jews living with them anymore. So they said the Jews are only allowed to live in one little neighborhood that we're gonna build a big wall around that neighborhood. And at nighttime, all the Jews have to be in that neighborhood. They can't be seen out on the streets of Venice. They're only allowed to live inside this area. And that area that they walled in was the site of the old iron foundry in the city of Venice. So it was Il Ghetto, the iron foundry. And that was the first ghetto. It was established in Venice. Many other cities across Europe after that decided to do the same thing. The first Talmud when the printing press was invented, the late 1400s, early 1500s, and the first Talmud was printed in Venice in 1520. Shabtai Tzvi was a false messiah. We have had false messiahs throughout the ages. He thought he was going to start a return to Israel. He traveled to Israel. At the time, it was under the Ottoman Empire rule. The Sultan in Turkey heard about this guy, Shabtai Tzvi, claiming to be the Messiah, the return of the Jews, and they're going to develop their own independent kingdom. And he called Shabtai Tzvi into his palace, and he said to him, "You will either convert to Islam right now, or I will cut off your head." He converted to Islam. Anyway, so that was the end of that, although his followers continued to believe he was the Messiah even after that. An interesting phenomenon. It's called cognitive dissonance. I can't believe he's not the Messiah. He must still be the Messiah, even though it's not working out the way we thought it would. And then in 1654, the first Jews arrive in New Amsterdam. This is kind of an interesting story. Oh, I've only got 5 more minutes left for modern period. So the Jews arrive in New Amsterdam, the first Jews to arrive in North America. Many Jews fled the Spanish Inquisition and came to South and Central America, but the Inquisition followed them. And so a bunch of Jews escaped from Central America on a boat. They went up north and landed at New Amsterdam. The ruler, the governor of New Amsterdam was Peter Stuyvesant. Maybe you remember him from American history. All I remember about him was that he had a peg leg. It kind of sticks in your head when you're in 3rd grade or whatever, when I learned it. He didn't like Jews. So when the Jews landed in New Amsterdam, he didn't want them to stay. But unfortunately for poor Peter Stuyvesant, he was there under the auspices of the West Indies Trading Company, and certain major stockholders of the West Indies Trading Company were Jews. And so when the Jewish people wrote to their landsmen, their countrymen in Holland, and said, "This guy won't let us stay," the Dutch West Indies Trading Company wrote to Peter Stuyvesant and said, "You will allow our Jewish cousins to stay in your country, or we'll call you back to Holland. You've lost your governorship." So he let them stay. And that's how the first Jews came to America. Okay, so here's some famous people who lived during the Middle Ages period. Here's some selected books written during the Middle Ages that are important to know about. And then we get into the modern period. Let me mention just a couple of things. The French Revolution. So Napoleon in 1791 turns to the Jews and says, "I want to take you out of the ghettos. We're going to integrate you into French society. You will become full citizens of the country of France. But before I do all of that, I'm going to convene a group of your scholars and sages, a Sanhedrin, a modern Sanhedrin of rabbis. And I'm going to put to them several questions to find out if they will be good citizens of my new French country that I'm forming." And of course, the rabbis knew what Napoleon was trying to get at and answered his questions to his satisfaction. And so he emancipated the Jews of France, and they were now, for the first time in most of Europe, considered full citizens of the country that they were living in. However, in the 1880s, not so good for Jews in Russia, the pogroms. If you want to see what that's like, there's a little hint of that in the play Fiddler on the Roof, which was made into a movie. Highly recommend it. It's kind of a fun play. And you will see how the Russian Cossacks used to come into Jewish villages every now and then just to burn a few houses, smash a few Jews, break some property, whatever, make life very unpleasant. And so many Jews started to flee Russia in the 1880s. And at the time, there was no quota for immigration of Jews from Russia in America. Unbelievable, no quota. Hundreds of thousands of Jews came to America during this period, hundreds of thousands, because there was no quota. About the same time, the first seminary for Jewish people in America was founded in Cincinnati, Ohio, the Hebrew Union College. Don't have time to go into too much detail. Yeah, all right, I'll talk about this also, just to talk about the Reform and Conservative movement. So it was formed by somewhat assimilated Jews in America, Jews who no longer considered keeping kosher important. And so when the first graduating class of rabbis from the Hebrew Union College were being graduated, they decided to celebrate in a typical American fashion with a formal black tie dinner, fancy china plates, great food, wine, big celebration, everybody wearing top hats. They got a fancy caterer from Chicago to come in and cater the event in Cincinnati. And as is the case with fancy formal dinners, the menu was on the plate, right? On a card, written out on a card on the plate for everybody to read. And the menu items included frog's legs, clam chowder, chicken cordon bleu, beef and ice cream for dessert. So you're mixing meat and milk. Virtually every combination of non-kosher food. The one thing that was not on the plate was pork, because they did know that pork was forbidden. But every other possible non-kosher food seemed to be included in the menu. The people who organized the banquet claimed they didn't realize it violated Jewish dietary laws. I'm not sure how they didn't know that. Anyway, the group of Jews who came into the banquet hall, read the menu, were highly offended, and walked out. We can't deal with these radical reformers. They threw the baby out with the bathwater. They've forgotten what it means to be Jewish. And so within a couple years later, they founded the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, which was the beginning of the conservative movement, which is going to conserve Jewish traditions. Right, so that's the Jewish Theological Seminary that I attended many decades later, a century later. Meanwhile, there's a trial against a Jew in France for treason. His name was Dreyfus. They claimed that he had betrayed the French people in their fight against the Russians, the Franco-Russian War, and he was tried for treason. During the course of the trial, it became clear that he had been framed, but he was nevertheless convicted by an anti-Semitic court. Émile Zola wrote his article J'accuse because he saw what was going on, and so did Theodor Herzl, who was a reporter from Vienna reporting on the trial. And he was so offended that the French people, of all people, the first to emancipate the Jews in Europe, would nevertheless be so anti-Semitic that he decided there was no hope for Jews in Europe. And he is the one who started this political Zionist movement with the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897. And I'll end with this. He wrote in his diary that night after the first Congress had concluded, "I know people will think I'm crazy, but I really believe that within 50 years, we will have our state." And 50 years after 1897 was 1947, and by 1948, the state of Israel was formed. The rest of the history you can read about. Didn't get to it, but modern history is more known to people, but some of the important dates and elements are in there. At the end of this handout is a list of suggested readings of books. If you are interested in any of the particular subjects discussed there, these are books that I recommend for philosophy, for history, for Bible, prayers, rabbinic law, Hebrew, Israel and Zionism, Judaism, Christianity, about conservative Judaism, about ethics, and even fiction. So if you're interested in any of those areas, check out the reading list that's at the end. I'm sorry I don't have any more time. We'll stop sharing now. I didn't have time for questions today, but I also apologize for that. It was 4,000 years of Jewish history in an hour. So now you can unfasten your seatbelts and But listen, so it was kind of quick and I didn't have time for questions, but if anybody has questions, please feel free to write me. The peg leg sticks in my head. Yeah, get it. Yeah. Yeah, but if anybody of you have any questions, please feel free to write me. I don't always answer emails. So if I don't answer your email, especially if you asked a really good question and I want to think about it, it gets buried. Write me again or call me and make an appointment. I always keep my appointments. I'm always happy to talk to anybody. And sometimes talking is actually a better way to discuss a subject. Okay, so thank you all for attending, and next week won't be quite so crazy trying to do 4,000 years of history in 1 hour. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was a great class.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Boker Tov.
Boker Tov.
Okay, Joe.
Okay, Tom.
So when I was studying Hebrew in Israel back a million years ago in 1987, that I think I might have told you this already, but there was this sort of remnant of sort of early Zionism, which had very, very poetic Hebrew. And so when you said Boker Tov, people might reply, if they were old, they might reply Boker Or, which is very, very nice. Boker Tov is good morning, and Boker Or is morning light. So it's very nice, right? Boker Tov, good morning, morning light, very poetic. Boker Or, morning light. So now I'm going to ask you how you are. I'm going to say, Manishma. Can you say that? Manishma.
Manishma.
Right. How are you? Manishma. Okay. Now, if you're doing well, Tov Toda.
Tov.
Tov.
Tov Toda.
Right. And if you're only you might say kacha kacha.
Ha ha ha.
So ha ha ha. So you can be honest or not honest, but if you're honest, go for it. I'm going to ask you how you are, and you can either say Tov Toda, or you can say Kacha Kacha. Okay. Mani Shma.
Tov Toda.
Toda.
Tov Toda.
And now you can ask me how I am.
Manishma.
Tov Toda.
Manishma.
Now, a lot of more religious people, instead of saying Tov or Kacha Kacha, will say Baruch Hashem, which is basically praise God. Can you say Baruch Hashem?
Baruch Hashem.
Baruch Hashem.
And the idea in saying praise God is that no matter how your day is going, you should have room in your heart and soul to God for the gift of life and the world around you. So Baruch Hashem. So that's like positive thinking. Baruch Hashem. To remember.
Baruch Hashem.
Okay, now I at the beginning of the year sent everyone an Aleph Bet sheet. Do you have your Aleph Bet sheet, or you can go to the back page of the book, page 95. And we're going to sing our Aleph Bet song, okay?
What? I can hear the teacher, but I cannot see anything.
Okay. Do you want me to put, I can put this, I can share the screen. Let me do this.
So you clicked on this and opened this video. I mean, this tab.
Okay.
See, you open this tab.
Okay, somebody needs to mute.
Really? Ah, where did I just move?
Okay. There we go.
Hey,
Thank you.
Can people see my screen?
Yes.
There's a lot
Yes.
of
Okay.
It's
So I'm going to do my best, but this Aleph Bet chart doesn't quite fit. I wonder if I can make the size different. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to be the leader and sing first, and then you'll echo me, okay?
Excuse me.
Aleph Bet Bet.
Aleph, Bet, Bet,
Gimel Dalet Hey.
Gimel, Dalet, Hey.
Vav Zayin Chet Tet.
Vav, Zayin,
Yod Kaf Chaf.
Yod, Kaf,
Lamed Mem Nun.
Lamed, Mem, Nun,
Samech Ayin Pei Fei.
Lamed, Hai, Pei,
Zadi Kuf Resh.
Sadi, Kuf, Resh,
Shin Sin Tav.
Shin, Sin, Tav.
Okay, now we're going to go like 3 times as fast, okay? Aleph Bet Bet.
Aleph, Bet, Bet,
Gimel Dalet Hey.
Gimel, Dalet, Hey.
Vav Zayin Chet Tet.
Vav, Zayin, Bet,
Yud Kaf Chaf.
Gimel, Kaf,
Lamed Mem Nun.
Lamed, Mem, Nun,
Samech Ayin Pei Fei.
Lamed, Hai, Pei, Pei,
Zadi Kuf Resh.
Sadi, Kuf, Resh,
Shin Sin Tav.
Shin, Sin, Tav.
Metsuyan. Okay, I'm gonna stop share. How many of you can do that from your book? Can anybody, or how many of you, let me rephrase that. How many of you made printed out copies of the Aleph Bet sheets that I sent out at the beginning? Do people have that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I would like to do this when I can see you and not have the screen on. So I'm just going to try to do the Aleph Bet this way. I would like somebody to be the leader. Would somebody volunteer to do the song? Would anybody volunteer to do it? No. Oh. Okay. Practice. Next week, I want somebody to volunteer.
I'll do it.
Okay, next week you'll do it for me? Or you'll do it now?
I'll do it right now. I just don't sing well.
Oh, I don't care.
Okay.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Aleph Bet Bet.
Aleph, Bet, Bet,
Gimel Dalet Hey.
Gimel, Dalet, Hey.
Vav Zayin Het Tet.
Vav Zayin Het.
Yud Kaf Kaf.
Yod
Kaf,
Kaf.
Resh Lamed Mem Nun.
Lamed, Mem, Nun,
Samech Ayin Pei Fei.
Samech Ayin Pei Fei.
Pei,
Zadi Kuf Resh.
Sadi, Kuf, Resh,
Sing Tav.
Shin, Sin, Tav.
Very good.
That is
job.
great. Thank you for being brave. Woo. You know, it's impossible to really learn without risking being a little bit embarrassed or maybe making a little bit of a mistake, right? So I encourage you to make lots of loud mistakes. Just get it out there, your loud mistakes, and no one will care. You know what? If you make a mistake, the worst thing that will happen is somebody will say, oh, thank God they're making a mistake too. It's not just me making a mistake. Okay? You'll just make someone else feel better if you make a mistake. So don't just take the risk, go out there and do it. Thank you, Dana. That was great. Thank you. Okay. So let's turn to chapter 3 in our books. Chapter 3 is on page 12. Okay. And we have the vocabulary word kala, kala, bride, kala. All right. And underneath kala, we have 3 new letters. And you might want to write these in right into your book if you want to. Lamed,
Lamed.
kaf, and hey. Lamed, kaf, and hey. Or you might want to just write the sounds of these letters in. Lamed is like an L. Kaf is a K. And hey is like an H. Lamed, kaf, hey is like LKH, right? And of course, I'm right to left. Okay. Underneath those circled letters are the letters that we've had for the last 2 classes. And so I'm going to read it once by myself, and then I'd like you to read them together with me. Bet, tav, tav, shin, mem. Can you read those with me? Bet, tav, tav, shin, mem. So what letter in English is like a bet?
B.
E. Very good. And what letter is like a tav?
T.
T. And what difference does the dot in the tav make?
Final sound.
That was a very reasonable guess. But it was a trick question. It makes no difference at all in a tav. It's just there to confuse you. Now, in old-fashioned European Hebrew, the Ashkenazic Hebrew that many Jews in Europe spoke, that tav, different sound when the dot was in it. But that doesn't matter anymore. Israel does not use Ashkenazic Hebrew, and the synagogue doesn't use Ashkenazic Hebrew. So you don't need to worry about it. It's just a T, whether or not it has a dot in it. Okay, the letter next to the tav, the shin, what sound does shin make?
SH.
Very good. SH. Very good. Shh. Like in shoe. And what sound does mem make?
M.
M. It's like an M. Right. Okay. And we have our vowels underneath, under those little circles. We have a horizontal line. That's called a patach. And we have a little T. That's called a kamatz. And they sound the same. What sound do they make? That's right. Ah. Okay. So I'll tell you what. On line 1, underneath, I'm going to read 2 and you read 2 and then I read 2. If the letter doesn't have, if the consonant doesn't have a vowel underneath, I'm just going to say the name of the letter, okay? But I'll start. La, la.
Lamed.
That's right, lamed. Going.
La.
Tell you what,
La.
I'm going to show you. I did not make my expectations clear. So I'm going to demonstrate what I want. Okay.
May I just ask a quick question, Canterdorf? Is it?
Yes.
You're on page 12. Is that correct?
Yes.
Chapter 3, line 1.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. I'm sorry that I wasn't clear. So I'll try to show you what I'm looking for. I'm going to say la la, and then you're going to say lamed,
Lamed.
and then I'm going to say lamed la. And we're going to do the whole page like that, okay? So I'd like
Okay.
people to be brave and unmute if you're willing to, just so that I can hear how you're doing. I see some of you really want to be muted, huh? Okay, let's give it a shot. It helps to hear you make mistakes because then I know how you're doing. Here we go. La, la,
Lamed la.
lamed la. Let's do the next line the same way. It's your turn. Line 2.
La la.
Lamed, la. Okay, line 3. La, ba,
Ba. Ta sha.
ma, ta. Your turn. Line 4.
La ba.
I'll do the next one. Lash,
La ma.
tal. Okay, line 5, I'll start. Oh, you start. Line 5, you do the first one.
Bal.
La, ta,
Shal.
mal. Okay, I'd like to give you maybe 2 or 3 minutes before we do lines 1, 2, and 3. If you need to write in any of the vowel sound, any of the consonant sounds, if you need to, take 2 or 3 minutes. If not, you can just practice lines 1, 2, and 3 on 13 by yourself for just a couple minutes. And if you want to prepare by writing something in, you may. Like you could write in the M's where there's a mem, and you can write in the L's where there's a lamed if you need to, things like that. Are people ready? Should we start reading? Yeah, okay. We'll do the same thing where since it's now like 2 syllables at a time, I'll do, you do the next one. So I'm going to do, first I read all of line 1, and then we'll go back and I'll do ma, and you'll do ma la, and I'll do la la, etc. But first I'll do the whole line. Line 1, ma, la, mal. Now let's go back. I'll do the first one, you do the second one. La, mal. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing with the next line. I'll read the whole line first. Sha, ba, la, lab, ba, la, ba, sha. Okay, now I'll do the first one, you do the second, etc. Shaba,
Bala,
Lab,
Lab.
Bala,
Basha.
Basha.
Good. Third line, I'm going to read it and then you'll do the first one. Ta, ta, la, ta, la, ba, sha, ta, lash. Okay, you start.
Ta
Ta, ta, ta,
Ta,
La, ta,
la,
la, ba,
sha, ta.
lash.
lash.
Good. Okay. Line. Can we do line 4 and 5? Is that okay? Yeah. All right. I'll read it first. Ba, ma, ba,
Mm.
shab, tam, shama. Okay, you start.
Bama,
Bat,
Bat.
Jab,
ham.
Shama.
Good. Okay, line 5. I'll read it. Lama, tama, shala, bal, mal. I'll start. Lama,
Lama.
Tama,
Lama.
shala,
Shala.
Bal,
mal.
Mal.
Now, I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but if there is anybody who would like to volunteer to read any of these lines that we just did, that would be lovely. Is there anybody who'd like to volunteer?
I'll do it.
Thank you. Just tell us which line you're doing.
I'll do 5.
Terrific.
Okay. Lama, Tama, Shala, Bal, Mal.
Woo! Very good. That was
Very good.
really, really good. I have to tell you, I probably told you this last week. I learned Hebrew as an adult. I was 29, and we belonged to like a Reform synagogue growing up, and I might have learned the alphabet, but I think that's as far as it went. It was like very classical Reform synagogue. So I learned it as an adult. I went to Israel. I was in an Ulpan. It was so hard for me. So, but obviously I know Hebrew now. But when I see people pick it up like that, I'm very impressed because it wasn't so fast for me. It's okay if no one else wants to do it, but I would love to hear someone else if they'd like to. Would anybody else like to? Oh, okay, Michaela, that's great.
I'll do line 3.
Okay.
Okay, so it's ta ta, la ta, la ba, sha ta, lash.
Metsuyan. Metsuyan. Excellent. Okay. This is a really good class. Okay. We're now in the middle of page 13. And we're going to do the letter Kaf. And for our purposes, it's just like a K. It's just like a K, like in kangaroo. So I'll read the first line, and then I think you can read it back to me. Okay, here we go. Ka, ka, kaf. Ka, ka, kaf. Can you read line 1 for me now? 1, 2, ready, go.
Ha, ha, ha,
Ka,
ha,
ka,
ha.
ka.
Okay, now I'd like you to take a second to take a look at line 2 and write in any sounds that you need to write in. You know, just take a few seconds to do that. Okay, I'm going to read line 2 and then you'll read it back to me. Ka, ba, lamed, tav, sha, ma. Can you try that? Go ahead. Ha,
Ka,
Ka,
ba,
Ba,
lamed,
lamed,
ta,
Ka,
sha,
Sha,
da,
Ma.
ma.
good. Okay, now let's take a look on line 3. I should have pointed it out earlier. Look how our first 2 letters are bet with a kamat and then kaf with a patak. So we have ba, ka. The bet and the kaf are very similar in appearance. Can someone describe for me how they look a little bit different? How does the bet look a little bit different from the kaf?
Well, when I think about bet, it looks like a bell. So I think about B, bet bell.
Oh, that's funny. Okay. I'm glad that works. Okay. That's good. Does anybody have another another observation about how it looks?
Yeah, the line on the bet is a lot longer at the bottom than on the kaf.
And it's straight.
Yeah, the line on the bottom. I'm going to say your name wrong, and I'm so sorry. Cosetti?
Yeah, Cosette. It's just when he's silent, it's fine.
Oh, it's like French or something, right?
Yeah. It's
Okay, so what were you going to say about bet and cuff?
the line is straight and it's very and it extends a little bit past as well on the right side, and the other one is curved. You see that?
Yes, right. So you could say cuff is curved. Cuff is curved. So that's another sort of memory thing we could use, right? We can also say this doesn't really help you to recognize them, but it helps remember the sounds. You can say Bet has a button and Cuff has a cookie. That's the things we do with the kids. Bet has a button and Cuff has a cookie. But if it helps you remember, it's fine. All right. But you're right. Bet, a few people have pointed this out. Bet has a sort of flat line that extends right beyond the upper formation, and Cuff is curved all the way around. Okay, I'm going to read line 3, and I hope you will do it after me. Ba, ka, tav. Ba, ka, mem.
Mem.
Can you read it for me now? Ba,
Ba,
Ka, tav, ba, ka, mem.
Mem.
Metsuyan. Okay, line 4. Oh boy, this is challenging. Here we go. I will read it. You can be taking notes if you need to, and then you'll try reading it back to me. Ka, la, ka, ma, mak, ba. I'll read it again. Ka, la, ka, ma, mak, ba, ka. Can you try reading it?
Ta, la,
Ka, ma, mak, ba, ka.
Very nice. Very nice. Okay, line 5. Ka, sha, bak, la, ka, ka, ta. And I'm going to read it again. Ka, sha, bak, la, ka, ta. Want to try? Ka,
sha,
Sha,
bak,
bak,
la, ka,
ka,
ta.
ta.
good. Okay. Now there's lots of great exercises that we don't have time for, unfortunately. But maybe we should in this case because because we're starting to have a lot more letters, right? And so for letter recognition, maybe it would be good to take a minute, maybe on page 14, why don't we take a few minutes to do lines 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So on line 1, they have a transliteration, la, right? And the book circles the lamed with an ah underneath. So why don't you try filling out lines 2, 3, 4, and 5? I think it shouldn't take more than a minute, and then we'll go over it. Maybe you could raise your hand when you're done, just to let me know. Thank you. Thank you. I think we'll just go over it now. First of all, I'm going to read the first line that's already circled because it's good reading practice. And then I'd like you to read it after me. Kaf, ta, shin, la, ba. Can you read that back to me?
Ka,
Off,
ta,
ta,
shin,
shin, la,
la,
ba.
ba.
Good. Okay. Second line, which, if we went from right to left and we said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? There's 5 letters. Which letter is the M sound?
Second one.
The
That's
second one.
right. That's right. The second.
Second.
That's right. Okay. So I'm going to read the line and then you read it. Ma, mem, tav, kaf, lamed. Can you read it back?
Ma,
Mom,
mem,
mem,
tav,
tav, tav, lamed.
lamed.
Good. Line 3, we're looking for ta. Is it 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? Is it 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? Ta.
4.
Correct. It's 4. It's 4. So I'll read the line and then you read it after me. Sha, ba, ma, ta, mem. Can you read?
Sa, ta, ma, ta, mem.
Good. Okay, line 4. Line 4. Okay. We're looking for the K sound. Just a K sound. Is it 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? The K.
4.
4.
4. It seems to be a little bit of a pattern. A certain, well, not completely, but they seem to like 4. Okay, I'm going to read the line and then you do. Ka, shin, mem, kaf, tav. Can you read it?
Ka,
Shin, Mem,
Tav,
Kav, Tav.
Tav,
Good. Line 5. Sha. Can you look for the sha?
Sha.
the
First
third
one.
one.
It's the first one. Nachon. I'll read it and then you read it. Sha, ba, shin, bet, ma. Now you try.
Sha,
Ma,
Ba,
Ba,
Shin,
Shin,
Bet,
Bet,
Ha.
Ma.
ma. Good. Okay. Now, at the bottom of the page, we are doing the hey, the letter hey, which is very, very much like an H in English. So I'm going to read that bottom paragraph where it says ending and beginning, because I'm sure you've noticed that in English, H is sometimes silent and sometimes pronounced. The letter hey is pronounced H, but when H comes at the end of a word and has no vowel under it, it has no sound. Read these words aloud and circle each H. Sorry, circle each hey that has no sound. Well, maybe we'll come back to that and do the exercise in a minute. But I want to point out, for example, in that most of the words in English where the H at the end is silent are actually words that come from Hebrew, like the name Sarah, right? The name Sarah. The H at the end of the name Sarah, I'm sorry, my Philadelphia accent's coming out, isn't it? The American name Sarah comes from Sarah, and it's Sarah-H, right? In Hebrew, it's a hey at the end and it's silent, right? Or this delicious bread that we eat on Shabbat, challah, right? Challah, the hey on the end is silent, right? And when we see it written in English, it's Challah. The H is silent. And when we say hallelujah, a lot of times when you see hallelujah written out, it's transliterated with an H at the end. And that's because in Hebrew, it has a hey at the end. So a hey at the end of a word is silent. Okay, so let's take a look at this reading practice for hey. I'll read the line and then you read the line. Line 1. Ha, ha, hey, ha, hey, ha. Now you read it.
Ha, ha, hey, ha, hey, ha.
Good. Line 2. Ha,
Ha,
ka, la, ma,
ha,
sha, ha.
ha.
Can you read it now?
Ha, ha,
Ba,
La,
la, ma, sha, ha.
Good. And on line 2, the second letter, for those of you who've had a little bit of Hebrew before, you probably remember that if there's not a dot in that letter, right? If kaf doesn't have a cookie in it, then it's pronounced kaf. But this has a cookie, so this kaf has a cookie, and therefore it's pronounced like a K, or like C in cookie. All right. So line 3. I'd like to recommend that you take a look at line 3 before I do it, and maybe take note of all of the letters. Make sure you know all the letters. You can write them in if you need to, just to give you a little foot up on it when we read it. Okay, Now I'm going to read it and then you read it. Ha, ka, ha, ma, ha, sha, ha, ta. Okay, give it a try.
Ha, ka,
Ah,
ha, ma,
Ma,
ha, sha, ha, ta.
Very nice. You don't need to all go at the same speed. Go at your own speed. Some of you will read faster and some will read slower. So you don't feel like you have to do it at any particular speed. Okay, but that was very good. Okay, on line 4, I again will read it. Maybe I'll read it twice and then you can read it. Hash, haba, kala, shaba. Hash,
Hash,
haba,
Haba, Kala,
kala,
Shaba.
shaba. Okay, now you give it a try.
Hash,
Hash,
hava,
Haba, Kala,
kala,
Shaba.
shaba.
Okay, very, very nice. Now, let's go back to the bottom and remember, the bottom of page 14, and remember that if the hey is at the beginning of the word, we pronounce it, and if it's at the end of the word, it's silent. So I'm going to read these 5 words. Maybe I'll read them twice and then see if you can do it. Habat, kala. Hatal, lama, mara. Habat, hala, hatal, lama, mara. Can you read them?
Habat,
Habat,
Kala,
kala,
Hata,
hatal,
Lama,
lama, mara.
Good. Okay. And it says, what does at the bottom challenge? What does ha shamash mean? Do you remember we had the vocabulary word shamash last week? Does anybody remember what the shamash is?
helper.
Helper. Very good. And on a Hanukkah menorah, which candle is usually the shamash?
the middle one.
The middle one. Thank you. Okay, let's see how much time do we have. Oh, we're not doing badly. Okay, here we go.
I have a quick question. This is Cosette. So on the last word that we had that we were reading beginning and ending, that middle word, that middle letter, I haven't seen that one before.
Oh, you know what? I think you're right. I don't think that they've given us that letter yet. Isn't that, they must have not realized it. Okay, well, you can write that in. That is a resh. Resh, an R. Resh.
And it's just like a curve,
Yeah.
like an upside down
It
hockey.
looks like the top half of a bet, right?
Okay.
It looks like the top half of the bet.
Okay.
Yeah, there are many, many letters that have that form with something added to it. The resh is kind of a basic form that other letters are shaped like. So yes, that is pretty funny that the editor didn't notice that. Well,
What letter is that? I don't know how to pronounce that.
so it's an R, and you should get like some bonus from the publisher for noticing it.
I don't know if they'd be happy I found that.
You know, any book that you spend a lot of time in, you're going to find a mistake. Yes. So, okay. On page 15, I will read line 1 and then you'll read it back to me. It's pretty basic, so I don't think we need to go over it too many times. I'll read it slowly and then you'll read it back, okay? Line 1 on 15. ba, ha, ta, ha, ka, ha.
Ba.
Ba. Ha.
Ha.
Ta.
Ha.
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 Ga.
Ha.
Ha.
Good. Okay. Line 2. I'll read it, let's say 3 times, and that way if you need to make any notes, you can. Hal, hab, hat, hash, hat, ha, ha. Hal, hab, hat, hash, hat, ha, ha. And again. Hal, hab, hat, hash, hat, ha, ha. Can you try reading it?
Hal. Hab. Hat. Hash. Hal. Ha. Ha. Oh, ha.
Good. Line 3, the same way. Here we go. Ba, ta, sha, la, ma, ha. Again. Ba, ta, sha, la, ma, ha. And again. Ba, ta, sha, la, ma, ha. Okay, you read it for me.
Ba. Ta. Sha. La. Ma. Ha.
Good. Line 4. Same deal. Ta, la, ba, ma, la, sha, ta, ma, shabbat. Ta, la, ba, ma, la, sha, ta, ma, shabbat. Now you do it. Ta, la,
Ba. Ma. La. Sha. Ka. Ma. Shabbat.
Nice reading. Okay, line 5. I'll do it twice, and then you do it. La, ma, ka, sha, ma, ta, la, sha. Again. La, ma, ka, sha, ma, ta, la, sha. Now you.
La. Ma. Ka. Ka. Sha. Ma. La. Sha.
Good. Okay. And then this is what I'd like to suggest for, maybe I should even write this down. For homework, first of all, let me put my email. And my phone number up again. Now, of course, all homework is just, oh, that's a typo. Let me do it again. That's wrong. There we go. Sorry, it's 569. There we go. It's the second number. So anybody who would like to either, for lines 6, 7, and 8, you can either try transliterating these, just like write it in right over the word. Or if you'd like to record yourself on your phone on voice memos and either text it to me or email it to me, and I will go over it for you. Okay. So that's actually, people who've done that in the past find it a worthwhile thing to do. You don't have to do it, but if you'd like to do homework and you'd like to get a little extra practice in, I would be very, very happy to go over your work. So for page 15, line 6, 7, and 8, you can either record yourself reading it, or you can transliterate those 3 lines and send it to me, and I'd be happy to either listen to your recording or go over your transliteration. I mean, all you need to do if you transliterate it is take a little picture with your phone and text it to me. Okay, we have just a little bit more time. There's a website that I wanted to show you, so maybe I'll do that if I can. Are you seeing my screen again?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. There was this website that I liked. Of course, my YouTube doesn't work very well. All right. I think I'll just send, I think I'll just copy the link and give it to you. All right, 1 second, and I'm just going to copy the link for you. Oh, it doesn't want to, here we go, paste. All right, I guess if it won't paste, I'll have to send it as an email. There's a really, really nice link that teaches you how to block write and then cursive write the alphabet. And I'd really like to give that to you, but I can't seem to copy it properly. So I'll have to send it as an email. Okay, let's continue on 16. Sorry about that. Let's continue on 16. Okay, so these are words that supposedly rhyme in each line. So I'm going to read the first word and you try to circle the word that rhymes with it. You don't have to say it out loud. We'll go back and do it. But line 1 on 16, kala, and you can scroll the word that rhymes with kala. Okay, line 2, shalal. What rhymes with shalal?
Balal.
Okay, what on line 2 rhymes with shalal? Okay, line 3. Oh, I see. I misunderstood the how this works. So on each line, there are 2 words that rhyme. So in the first 2, they rhyme with the first word, but starting on line 3, it is not the first, it doesn't rhyme with the first word. It rhymes with another word. Okay, line 3 and 4, you're going to have to do on your own. Okay, on line 1, what rhymes with kala?
Bala.
Tala, right.
Allah.
Line 2, what rhymes with shalal?
Halal.
Halal.
Talal, good, talal. On line 3, which 2 words rhyme?
Kama
And ma.
and lama.
Yay, good. Okay, and then on line 4, which 2 words rhyme?
Mashal and Bashal.
Good, fantastic. I just want to give everybody a reminder. You could, as we work our way through the book, make like a little reference for yourself, maybe on a Post-it note or an index card, where as we go through the book and we learn new letters and vowel sounds, you could write them down on a Post-it or a card and bring it from page to page with you. So that if there's a letter that or a sound that you don't remember, instead of having to go back and see where it was in the book, you'll have it on a card or a Post-it note right in front of you, right? And you can just keep adding to it as we work our way through the book. Because it's after a few chapters, it's hard to keep all of the letters in your head, right? Although that's what we're striving for. All right. So I gave you my email and I gave you my phone number if you want to text. If you ever want to go over something or there's something you don't understand, I would love to hear from you and I would love to help you. I really, really want to help everybody learn to read Hebrew.
Diane, are both of the phone numbers yours?
I'm sorry?
Are both of the phone numbers?
No, oh, I'm sorry. You know, I don't know how to delete it, but the 469 is a typo.
Is it the
569 is a typo. It's just 569. There might be some way of deleting that, but I don't know how.
And we can text you. Like if we want to do the voice recording or something, we can text it to you.
Yeah, if you can text me to send me something, and you can text me if you have a question or you want to talk to me.
Okay.
So I'm happy to. So really, it's a pleasure. I'm so happy you want to learn Hebrew.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Have a fantastic, healthy week. Okay. Enjoy this beautiful weather, and I'll see you next Sunday.
Thank you, Diane.
Bye. Thank you.
Great class. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.